I called friends and said, I'm going to do this. And they said, you're out of your mind. As a poor graduate student, you have to find ways to support yourself. So I was a system administrator. My job was to fix machines.
Welcome back, aliens. My name is Devin Reddy, and today we have one and only Venkat Subramaniam. This is a fan moment for me. So basically, when I go to different conferences, sometimes when my subscribers meet me, they mention this word fan moment. I never realized it. This is the first time. In fact, I'm following you from a long time, 2013 where I started. And I started communicating with you in 2014 itself. I wanted to get some tips how to be a great speaker because I always wanted to be on stage and talk in front of thousands of people. When I looked at you, the way you talk in front of public, it's amazing. And the way you convey the thoughts, the concepts, it's amazing. So I wanted to do a live session with you because you are in different country, I'm from different country. But then the moment I saw the message on LinkedIn that you are coming to Bangalore, I thought this is a time. I want to take this interview. So first of all, for everyone else, I'm not sure if you are following Java language, but if you are into Java technology, you surely knows Venkat Subramaniam. So let's hear it from you, sir, first.
Well, thanks, Naveen. Really appreciate you having me on this one. It's a great pleasure, and it's great to be able to talk about technology, talk about software development. So thank you for this opportunity.
That's great. In fact, I have a lot of questions. I have actually cut down the questions so that we can finish that in time. The first question for you would be, I want to understand your journey, how you started and how you reached till this place, because that's what I want to follow as well. I want to be a person like you, to be into different conferences, talk about different things. And so I want to understand your journey so that I can at least get some inspiration from it.
So my journey was quite an accident, actually. I never really intended to be in software development. I was working on my PhD, and as a poor graduate student, you have to find ways to support yourself. So I was a system administrator. My job was to fix machines. And obviously, I'm talking about 30 years ago now. And you have to work during the night because during the day, people use the machines.
Yeah.
And so working through the night and trying to do research during the day is incredibly difficult because you need to also have time to sleep and go to classes. So I was desperately trying to get out of being a system administrator and so I can focus on my dissertation and graduate. And the short answer was, no, I can't really do that because the department wanted system administrators. And then this relatively new language called C++ had just come out a few years earlier, and they were desperately looking for somebody to teach it. And I had no clue what C++ actually was, but I was eager to quit what I was doing. So I said, I'll teach it. And a professor said they will teach it. And then a month before the semester, the professor said, I don't want to teach it. So the department looked at me and said, well, that's yours now. And so it was thrown into the mix. And I called friends and said, I'm going to do this. And they said, you're out of your mind. You don't even know what programming is. You can't really do this. And so I had a month to really become an expert on it. And that's how my journey started. And everything else is history. Spent 14 years.
That sounds crazy. It's C++ in a month.
And spent 14 years teaching C++. I would say wrote several production software using C++ back in time for various engineering companies. And then eventually moved on to other languages, including Java and C# and Ruby and so on. And here we are.
Oh, that's great. So when did you started doing the conference thing?
So that again was pretty an accidental journey, and that's kind of the most important thing to think about is it's not that we sit down and plan these things and sit down and say, here's what we want to do. If you ask me what's my 5-year plan, I'll be honest, I don't even know what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. So essentially, I'm not a long-term planner. I'm very passionate, but I'm not ambitious in the sense of here's what I want to do in 10 years or 5 years from now. But I'm very passionate. So I started learning about things, and when I get excited, I want to go speak in events to share the knowledge. And back in time, this was about 20 years ago, or maybe 23 years ago, I used to speak at Houston Java user group,
Okay.
and then Houston .NET user group. So, and then they kind of figured, 1 month in a year, you can just give it to Venkat. That's fewer people to look for as a speaker every year. So I would speak, usually in February in Houston Java user group, and then October in .NET user group. And that went on for a few years, and it occasionally, incidentally, I was speaking at the Houston Java user group when a gentleman who runs a popular conference, they had just started a year ago, earlier at that time, came to promote the conference at the user group. Didn't know of me. I haven't written any books at that time. I was a local, speaker, and he sat down and saw me speak, and he came to me and said, "Would you like to come and speak in my conference?" And he had promoted the conference, and he talked about again, you think about 20, 25 years ago. He said the speakers in the conference are Dave Thomas, who had published one of the most famous pragmatic programmers book at that time. Jason Hunter, you may remember the famous Kettle book for the Servlet API, and James Duncan Davidson, the guy who wrote Ant and Tomcat, and Bruce Tate, who had written books like Bitter Java and Bitter EJB. Those were the speakers at the conference.
That's a big stage.
And then I'm this unknown person, and he said, "Would you like to come and speak in the conference?" I seriously thought he was joking, and I said, "Well, thanks for asking, but." And then I go home that night and I see an email from him saying, "Hey, I want you to just give exactly that talk that you just gave. Can you come and give that talk, in this conference in Houston?" And I was living in Houston at that time, so I went and spoke at the conference. And once that was over, he said, "You want to come and speak in Chicago?" The next thing I know, I speak in Chicago. And the next thing I know, I'm traveling the country and speaking. And then eventually, word gets out. Then I go to the international stage, and one thing leads to another. So pretty incremental.
That's awesome. Because I saw your website, Agile Developers, and then there's a session on talks, and the list of talks you will be doing this year, it's huge. So that's the question I had. Now coming back to your videos titles. So whatever talks you give, I've seen the titles are not normal. It's not like, okay, let's talk about Scala, let's talk about Kotlin. No, it's about, so one of the titles which was "Don't walk away from complexity, run." So how do you choose your titles? Is it you choose it, or the conference people, they give you this talk?
No, so one of the key things about giving talks is almost like you're not effective doing what others want you to do. You need to really find what you are passionate about. And generally speaking, every talk gets written in a flight, in the bathroom. It could be in the middle of giving another talk. So a lot of times your talks are kind of forming in your mind. There's a thread that's running in the background, and a certain particular concept comes to your mind. You're having a meeting with a client, or you're discussing a particular project with a fellow developer, or you're writing a book or an article, and then you come up with a particular nuance about a certain idea or a certain concept. And then you start thinking about it, and then you realize, well, that could be really a good talk. And then it's kind of like you are taking one particular point, and then you are illuminating that. So, for example, "Don't walk away from complexity, run," is essentially, I was working with a team, and they wanted me to convert code from C++ to Scala. And because I had done quite a bit of C++ and I had done Scala, I mistakenly said yes. And when I started working on it is when I really got dragged into complexity. And as I was fighting that particular battle, I thought to myself, well, this is frustrating. And here are anti-patterns, do's and don'ts. And then I realized, wait, but this is not the only time that I'm dealing with complexities like this. There are other projects and other experiences, but now there's a thread. What if I can take those experiences and come up with a message and convey that as a keynote or a talk. And then you're like, okay, so it's around complexity, but what should we do? Well, as developers, we get dragged into complexity. But if we can have a sense to avoid it as we develop applications and to continuously refactor, that can help us a great deal, because this is, as a team, as an organization, as a company, and as an individual, this is the suffering we go through every day.
Right.
And then immediately you realize and you want to write a talk. But what's really important about almost everything we do, and I wish I really had learned this earlier on in my life, and a lot of times we don't get the training that will prepare us for what we need to do. But one of the most important things to do is to almost always have a piece of paper. That's a given in terms of how we work. And I'm just looking for my paper that I put in my pocket earlier. I think it's in my front pocket. And you constantly have that pencil and paper with you. And when you get these ideas, a lot of us have these ideas. But unfortunately, we don't really capture those ideas at the moments they arise. 10 minutes later, it's gone.
Right.
And it's very difficult to really get those back. It could be a phrase, it could be an example, it could be an anecdote, it could be an analogy.
Right.
And when those things appear, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's frustrating when you think about it, but immediately you got to start jotting them down. One of the keynotes I'm giving this year is a keynote called, Decision Dials. And so the idea of decision dial is, I was thinking about this about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and sometimes it takes a long time to prepare these things. But one day I was thinking about something and I said, wait, but we tend to think of decisions often as binary, this or that.
Right.
But a lot of times, when you're sitting in a car, you are not turning off volume, you're increasing volume, you're decreasing volume.
Right.
But a lot of times there is an interplay of decisions. And so decisions are not really switches, they really are dials. And the minute that thought comes to my mind, I'm like, oh, wait, but that could be a really nice keynote to present, but a lesson to carry on to challenge our thinking. And immediately you start taking notes. So there is a separate folder where you're grabbing analogies. You're listening to radio, and they're talking about certain event. And you're like, wait, that particular event could be a good analogy to use, but that's gone if you don't take notes of it. So immediately it goes into that file. Here is a reference to this particular story that happened, and here's how you can relate to it. So you literally, not just the title, but the content, you're building into it. And a lot of these content, whether it's a talk or whether it's a keynote, just about anything, Martin Fowler calls this as information set. An info set is literally a core dump of all these different ideas. Not all of them will make into a talk or a keynote, but you want to capture them. And you throw them in, and you just keep collecting them until you feel like there is a substantial amount of details to work with, whether it's a talk or whether it's a keynote. And then you take this information in, and then you ask the question, what is this narrative arc, right? I want to start here and I want to end here, but what's the journey I can take to get there? This comes from experience. When you're a novice, it's incredibly hard to do this. When I gave my first talk, this was literally 30 years ago. When I gave my first talk, this was a conference in Phoenix. And the topic was related to my PhD dissertation. And my professor said, fly over to Phoenix, talk in this conference. The talk was 20 minutes long. And I remember spending countless hours practicing for this talk over and over and over and over. It's the mistake that a novice makes, and which is what I did too. And then when I go and deliver the talk, it was a disaster. And then you look back and learn from it and understand what worked and what didn't work. And then you prepare very differently as an expert compared to a novice.
Right.
And so now I don't prepare giving the talk, I prepare the talk. That's
Okay.
the biggest distinction. So I don't spend any time practicing the talk, but I instead focus on the content.
Content, yeah.
And then once you do, the key is to develop that narrative arc. And when you develop this narrative arc, you are, and it's all about storytelling. But the key is you want to tell a story, not a tale, because people lose interest when you tell a tale.
Okay.
So you want to come in and you talk about, oh, here is a problem with the complexity. Well, here's an example where that really hurt us. You got about 30 seconds to maybe a minute to give that analogy, and then you want to come back to the essential concept.
Okay.
And then you build these stories to draw this path that you want to take the audience through.
Right. And that's how you engage your audience.
And well, you engage your audience, but it also draws the underpinning for these stories as well. But then what really, one of the biggest distinctions is, and I think this is where it makes a difference. And you mentioned that you saw all these talks on the website, and this is unfortunate, but not a lot of people give one talk in a year, whereas some of us give one talk every day or one talk every week. So some of us have it's a little bit unfair because if I compete, I can never compete with the Olympic athlete because an Olympic athlete is a professional.
Right.
If I try to say I can either run or do hiking or climbing, they will eat me up and walk away because they do it at a very different level than I would be able to do it. In a similar way, if somebody gives a talk once a year, that's a one shot they have to give the talk.
Right.
But the problem a lot of times is, I call it the rule of three. And the rule of three is the very first time I give a talk is when I begin to realize what actually works and what doesn't work. And then I would go redo the talk. And about the third time I give a talk is when I lock in that narrative arc. It's getting better over the years, but it never gets perfect.
Right.
So, and then you start removing content and adding content and reordering them.
Right.
And it's funny because the act of giving a talk really helps you to reframe the talk so you can deliver it better the next time. So I get to speak in a conference almost every other week.
Okay.
So I have that luxury of refining a talk multiple times.
Right.
So when you see the talk being given, it's very smooth, but it came out of that preparation, which I may have worked for a year preparing a talk, delivering that a few times, redoing it a few times, and then of course the practice, right? You never go deliver a talk without practicing.
True.
And it's almost like everything else. When you see something is really effortless, it usually means there's a lot of effort that's gone into it. And when you see that it's not really delivered smoothly, that usually is a reflection that not much effort has gone. Right. So a lot of these things kind of work together to bring that synergy. But the key is taking that notes.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be thinking about these when you're walking the dog, when you're taking a shower, when you're working on a problem, and when something comes to you. This is true not only for giving a talk, but for a blog post, for writing a book. Things that go into a book go into an info set before they go into a book.
Right.
And then sift through, and there are things that make it, there are things that don't make it. But writing that down is one of the things I wish they had taught me.
So on that, I have a question now. Do you maintain a digital copy of it, or you still prefer book and paper?
So both. And the digital copy is very important because you lose a paper or it's really hard to search on a paper. But a lot of times, the digital version is not fast enough to capture your thought when it comes to your mind. You could be literally walking on the road and you're like, oh my gosh, I could be writing about this, or I could be, thinking about this way of prototyping, or even investigating solutions to problems. And I go on a hike on mountains a lot, And when I'm up on the mountains is when I get a lot of ideas for books actually.
Okay.
And I want to really scribble it on a piece of paper because it's too slow to be typing that into a device at that time. So I scribble on papers a lot. But then when I come back home, when I'm near my computer, and usually a computer is much easier than a handheld device to keep typing it in, and I would just open up my file and I would just type those in, and those become easy to search. So later on, when you're giving a, preparing for a talk or writing a book, you want to be able to search through these very quickly and find things to bring them to memory.
Right.
So they start on a paper, but they live in an electronic form for the searchability.
Makes sense, makes sense. Cool. So moving away from the great speaker to a technical person now. So I have a few questions related to Java because, of course, we all talk about Java language nowadays. So when you talk about the releases, in fact, in one of your talk you mentioned that Java 8 is actually a reborn of Java, where Java was about to die. Because of Java 8, it again got the momentum and industry started using it. But now if you see the release, Oracle is doing release every 6 months now. So what are your thoughts on the releases in every 6 months? Is it easy for developers to adapt it, or they are just doing it so that they can compete with other languages?
So there are twofold to this. One is if you really let's separate these two out. The 6 months releases is really all about agility in terms of evolution of the language. If you look back in time, they did something that we all know not to do, and yet that's exactly where they fell into the trap. And if you say, here is everything that's going to go to a release, into a release, when you have the least idea of the complexities and the challenges involved, which is very counter to what we do in our field. From the agile development point of view, the entire point about agility is adaptive planning. So they finally realized, and I think this is one of the best remarkable things they actually did, is to say, we are not going to commit what actually goes into a release. We're going to work on these features. The features are going to take as much time as they take. For example, if you take a feature in Java 10, which is type inference, they literally took 5 years to develop it. If you look at the feature in Java 19, which is virtual threads, they've taken 15 years to develop it. These were not done in 6 months.
Right.
But the beauty is, when you have these multiple features coming in, they are not saying a release will have these features in it. When a feature is ready, it can be released.
Okay.
This is very adaptive. This is being very practical. So by doing so, they have managed to release more features by not committing to the features ahead of time. This is the true, living example of what true agility should be and can be. This is a great lesson for the rest of us to learn from in terms of how they have been developing it. So the release cycle of Java is not about you and me as developers. The release cycle of Java is about the development of the Java language.
Right.
To be agile, to be able to release, much more frequently, and to be able to take the feedback from developers and to be able to come back and refine it. But having said that, as a programmer, what does that mean to us? Practically speaking, this is a question I ask all the time. I go to developers and say, tell me something in Java 8 that you're excited about, right? The immediate answer is Lambda expressions.
Right.
And I'd say, okay, cool, tell me more. Streams. Cool, tell me more. And they're like, what else can I tell you?
Same point.
We totally forgot about completable future. Now, in fact, I wrote a book on Java 8. I didn't even mention completable future in it. Why is that? The reason is, when you are given so much in one shot, there's only so much you can take.
Right.
And so your focus is going to be on some aspects, and the others you're probably not going to pay attention to.
True.
Now Java is being released in bite-size releases. You can focus on a release, and you can say, what's in this release? Oh, you got type inference. Great. I can focus on type inference. I've got 6 months to focus on one thing.
Right.
What's in this one? Oh, you got records. What else? That's it. Focus on records. You got text blocks. What else? That's it. So you got this bite-sized improvement. If you're keeping up with the changes, you can keep up with these because it's not overwhelming. You're not thrust on 70 things you can learn. Hey, there's one thing you can learn about.
Right.
But the challenge, though, is this now turns into agility on the development of application side. We talk about agility, but are we truly agile?
Right.
Well, unfortunately, though, in a corporate environment, if I fear making change, because if I make a change, what if things break? Well, if things break, I'm going to be in trouble, so I'm not going to change. Well, if I don't change, now I'm holding on to Java 8, literally 9 years after release.
Right.
This is not going to help me to keep up with the change in the language. So now I look at Java, oh my gosh, there are 70 things I need to learn because I haven't kept up with it.
Yeah.
So this is not situation to be fearful of the change, but to really question that and say, why are we not able to keep up with it? Well, if we don't have sustainable engineering practices, we're going to be resistant to change.
Right.
And if we resist changing, it's going to push us back. And if we get pushed back, it's going to increase the cost of us changing in the future. So this is an opportunity for us as developers to ask the question, rather than talking about being, doing agile, how can we be agile? And that really comes back to following, fairly good automated testing, reducing complexity, keeping with change, being incremental. Then we can be in sync with the change. So is it easy or hard to developers? The answer to that is it's easy for Oracle because not because they want it to be easy, they want it to be effective, right?
Right.
And because they are effective, now it's easy for them to keep moving the language.
Right.
But that's just lesson for us to look back and say, what can we do to embrace that change? Because after all, agile development is about embracing change.
True. True.
If I can't embrace the change in the evolution of the language, the question there is to ask the question, what's the reason for it?
Yeah.
And so if we are able to embrace the change, it's easy. Otherwise, I think it's hard.
Cool. A lot of different perspective on one thing. Awesome. Now, this question is actually coming from the audience, which is towards the JavaScript language. I have seen it's my observation as well, and for me, I started my career as a Java developer. I worked on Kotlin, moved to Scala, explored those technologies. Every time I wanted to learn JavaScript or make a project on JavaScript, it's not like I have not done it, but I was trying to stay away from JavaScript. So why do you think, if you are agree with this point, but why do you think Java developers stay away from JavaScript?
I can tell you from my own perspective. So again, I'm going back about 25 years ago. It's not that I stayed away from JavaScript. I feared JavaScript.
Yeah, okay.
And part of the reason I feared JavaScript back in time, I came from the background of C++, like I mentioned earlier, and I started programming in Java and C#. You can see the pattern here. All of them are statically typed languages.
Yeah.
You had a compiler for C++ that verified your, variables and types. And yes, you could cast your way through, but Java made it a lot more easier to verify the types, and so did C#. And all of a sudden, you look at this JavaScript, it's on one hand dynamically typed, and then even making it worse, it's weakly typed as well.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like suddenly you are walking on ice.
Yeah.
You don't have a balance. You keep falling down, and it becomes very frustrating. And so I fear JavaScript because it really did not give me the guardrails that the statically typed languages gave me. And that fear turned into hatred for the language.
Yeah.
And so I never touched it.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had really good friends
Mm-hmm.
who were leveraging the power of dynamically typed languages like
Mm-hmm.
Ruby and Python.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, my gosh, I can't handle that.
Mm-hmm.
But then I see them, they're not only, they're smart people,
Mm-hmm.
they're very capable,
Mm-hmm.
and they're delivering results
Mm-hmm.
with as much agility, if not more, than I can imagine.
Okay.
And then I asked the question, why is it that they are not afraid? What makes them different? And for me, at least, that journey really coincided with finally embracing test-driven development. And I started writing automated tests for my C# code, for my Java code. And I went from, oh, I know unit testing to, oh, I am practicing test-first development.
Yeah.
And once I started writing automated tests, I said, wait, not only can I write automated tests for my Java code, I can do it for Ruby, I can do it for Groovy. And the minute I started doing it, I'm like, wait, if I'm writing automated test, the reason I didn't like dynamic type languages is I don't have that guardrail.
Yeah.
But now I do have one. So the guardrails come in different forms. A compiler is a guardrail,
Yeah.
but as you know, a code may compile in Scala, Kotlin, Java, C#, C++,
Yeah.
but occasionally it may fail at runtime.
Right.
You can never write code that is correct because the compiler compiled it. That's not to say I don't need a compiler.
Yeah.
I want a compiler,
Yeah.
but in addition to it, I also need yet another guardrail, which is automated testing.
Testing.
But if I take that up a notch and rely a lot more on automated testing, now my fear of the language goes away
Right.
because I have an early feedback loop.
Yeah.
So to me, I started embracing dynamic type languages when I actually started practicing automated testing. And so now I actually, in all honesty, over the past about 10, maybe even a little longer, I've written more production code in dynamic type languages than statically typed languages. And the reason for that is the me embracing the test-driven development, test-first development more than anything else.
Yeah.
And so to answer the question, maybe other developers are like me, where they fear this because they don't have the guardrails. You know, I drive up some mountains which have nice, roads, but it's freakily, fearful
Yeah.
when the mountains don't have guardrails.
Right.
And how many times do you hit the guardrails? I hope zero times,
times, yeah.
right? But the fact that there's a guardrail
It gives you a confidence.
gives you the confidence. It tells you if you were to miss, there is a last protection there.
True.
And on the roads that have guardrails, I still drive cautiously but with more confidence
Yeah.
than the roads where there are no guardrails.
True.
And to me, that automated testing is the guardrail that removes the fear
Yeah.
and lets me embrace these technologies for the greater good.
And that's a good perspective. In fact, I am trying to learn JavaScript. I worked on it, but every time you start working on a new project and you realize, okay, this is a new feature which is new for me.
Yep.
Cool. Now, in one of the talk, again, it's all coming from your talks only, I think. You mentioned about learning an extra language even if you're not using it. So what are your thoughts if, as a new developer, if they are starting their journey with any language, doesn't matter, Java, C++, or C#, should they learn another language just for the safety, or will it help them in the primary language as well?
Well, so fundamentally, one of the key things for us to realize is language design is application design. And that is, let me again take back to about, 25 years. I predominantly was programming in C++. I was developing applications for, companies in C++. And when Java came out, they talked about something called interface-based inheritance. That just blew my mind, honestly. I'm like, what in the world? I have written C++ classes, I do inheritance, but how could you inherit an interface apart from a class? And you may call me silly and say, duh, that's a fundamental concept.
Yeah.
It is if you start with Java. But when you start with C++, that's not something you talk about, you discuss.
Yeah.
Never heard of anonymous inner classes, right? And the minute you see these concepts, you're like, whoa, what are these? And you're learning a language, but you're learning a design idea.
Yeah.
And to give you another example of this, I was programming on a project in C++, in C# for a company, and we were pairing up and working together, and we were supposed to implement a particular class that managed some transactions. And as we were writing the code, really good developer, he said, we could write it this way. And I said, hey, would you mind if we try a slightly different idea in C#? He was like, well, why not? Go ahead and try it. So I showed him a different way to do it. And he literally stood up and said, wait, I've never seen a C# code written like this.
Oh.
This is intriguing. It blows my mind. And as he was saying it, the team leader came around and he looked at what we were doing and he gave a pat on my back and said, are you trying to write Ruby code in C#? And I looked at him and said, what do you think? He's like, that's brilliant. And that's exactly literally what I did. I took the execute around method pattern, which is very common in Ruby, and applied it to C# code because C# had link lambda expressions available. And to me, that's the reason I want to learn different languages.
Yeah.
When you learn a different language, it changes your thinking on how you can use your own language. Much like how travel helps you to broaden your mind.
Yeah.
You go to a place not because you want to live there, but you see things and you say, wait, that's a different way of doing things. Or I haven't seen that one. Or, oh, that's a nice way to hang something. And you come home and you can adapt something like that.
Right.
And it changes your living, right? It changes how you do things. That's the reason you want to. So to me, learning a language is not so you can program in it, so you can come back and program differently in the language you actually use. And so in effect, I would say it's not about learning a different language, it's really about learning a different paradigm.
Right.
Because when you learn a different paradigm, it changes your way of thinking. And now when it changes your way of thinking, you can embrace that different way of thinking within the constraints, but within the capabilities of the language you're programming in as well.
Cool, cool. Two more questions, one from my side and one from the audience. One of the questions which I had is, whenever you give a presentation, the IDE which you use or the tool which you use, which is a transparent background or transparent screen, in background you have your photos which you take. I want to understand which tool is that, because I'm trying to search about that tool from a long time. I got some tools, but you also give a tick there if the talk is happen on that particular topic. So I just want to understand what tool you use.
So this really goes back to something that I tend to really practice, which is not just in programming, but in life, which is minimalism.
Okay.
And a minimalism is essentially a way where you think about accomplishing what you do with the fewest things you can get away with.
Right.
You're building a application. Can I have fewer interfaces? Can I have fewer classes? Can I have fewer dependencies?
Okay.
Because the more of these I have, the complexity goes through the roof, becomes really hard.
Right.
Similarly, for what you do around, can I buy a standing desk, or can I put things together using what I can find, improvise? So that minimalistic thinking allows us to make use of things and reduce complexity, bring it down to a minimum, which is what I've been trying in presentations. So the very first step in that was getting rid of PowerPoints and keynotes. When you're a programmer, you don't program in PowerPoint. I hope not. Yeah. You don't program in a keynote. You program with an editor or an IDE.
Yeah.
So the first thing I did was, when I started giving technical talks, not keynotes, but programming talks, I got rid of PowerPoints and keynotes. Okay. Then I said, I'll use an IDE to give a talk. Well, that's great. But as opposed to writing a project where you have hundreds of files and you want to move around different directories, a presentation often gives you a view of a very narrow piece of code.
Yeah.
You want to bring a file, you don't want to sit there and create a project and open up an IDE, navigate through directory structure.
Yeah.
You are losing sight of what you want to show to the audience. You're taking focus away from the most essential aspect. This really goes back to the famous saying, and I really am almost in tears when I say this because I just spent the entire this morning removing sections from the chapter I'm writing right now, based on a wonderful feedback I got, because the person who was reviewing my chapter said, "Why are you talking about these things? How does it matter to the reader?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Wow, I wrote all this. Now I'm gonna." So I spent this entire morning removing sections from the chapter, not adding them. This goes to the famous quote, perfection is achieved not when there is something more to add, but when there is nothing more to remove. So that's minimalism. So an IDE is not minimalistic because you got a project structure and hierarchy to deal with. So then I said, what if I can just go to an editor and just run a file? So I used to use TextMate. And TextMate gave a transparent background, and I can just write code in there, keep going. Then TextMate changed. They removed the transparent background. They made it a little bit more complex. And I realized maybe I'm not minimalistic yet. So I got rid of that. Then I said, what if I can come down to the most fundamental with nothing around? So these days I'm in literally a terminal on the Mac. And the terminal gives you a transparent background. And I use Vim, and I open up a file in Vim, and Vim has a ability to provide macros. And you can define macros. Macros are keystrokes that translates to actions. So I wrote a Vim macro that said, if you press this key, turn the dash into a check mark. And then in Vim, you can press a button, and you can tell the macro if this key is pressed, then run this, literally save this file, and run this shell command on the underlying operating system. Then I say, okay, if the shell is called, the shell says, what's your file extension? Are you JavaScript? Are you PY Python? Are you Java? Are you C#? Are you C++? Are you whatever? Then it simply fires up different scripts. The different scripts run different compilers as necessary, different tooling. They dump the output to a directory. Then I use Quicksilver on the Mac to do a tooltip. So it's purely a bunch of scripts. And that is one of the things that we get to realize is when you're a programmer, you are able to program the system. You are not a user of a computer like a doctor is, with all respect, right? Doctors are awesome in the medical field, but they're not going to be great in a computer. An accountant is great in accounting. I can never do that. But they're not good in the computers. But for us, we got an edge. We are good in programming, and the machines we use are the tools of the trade itself. A dentist looks at the teeth, but their tools are not dentistry. They're tools used for dentistry. We are in a unique situation where the machines we program are part of the ecosystem. So we cannot be using our tools like the users of our tools who are not programmers. So fundamentally, when you realize that you can automate stuff by writing scripts, then it liberates you from things you are required to do, and you figure out things that you want to do.
Awesome. So do you have any plan of pushing it on open source so that others can use it?
There's not a whole lot to open source. That's the interesting part, is because it's purely a bunch of macros in VI. So the open source document is going to say, learn VI, explore, and don't hold back. He's the open source.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I will surely do that. Okay. Last question. It's regarding the modern Java term which we use. So basically, we are getting a lot of new updates in Java, and then we are saying we are working on modern Java now. But if you look at the industry, are they adapting this new modern Java, or they're still sticking to the older versions?
So the unfortunate thing is there is no one industry to talk about. When I go to conferences, I typically would ask a large set of audience what version of Java they are using.
Yeah.
And it varies widely based on where in the world you are. Europeans generally are a little bit ahead.
Okay.
They tend to be much closer to the recent releases. In the US, we are a little bit behind for various reasons. So it really depends on which industry, which part of the world you are looking at. But my analysis or assessment really is that organizations that generally tend to use lightweight tools and have better engineering practices are staying abreast a lot more easily than organizations that are using more heavyweight tools and don't have good engineering practices. So it really comes down to which part of the industry you are part of. So if you're part of the industry which is doing having good feedback loops, using lightweight tools, you're more adaptive, and as a result you're staying abreast. If you're working on projects or teams where they tend to have poorer or are not as rigorous engineering practices, or have teams that are stuck to heavyweight tools that takes more years to move forward, then they tend to really stay behind as well. So it varies quite a bit. I have personally know here in India, I have some clients that I work with continuously who are on the current version of Java all the way down. It's liberating to work with them because they are moving on to adapting the latest version of Java as soon as it comes out. On the other hand, I've also worked with companies around the world that are still in Java 8, as much as in India, as much as in any other country. So, my clients in India who are abreast of Java are following those practices I talked about much more effectively. Very mature team. It's always a pleasure to work with the team because I feel like I'm working with adults. On the other hand, when you work with teams that are not as mature, then you feel that burden of that lack of maturity as well.
Awesome. So, in fact, I have learned a lot of things from you today, plus a different perspective towards the same thing which I know. So, thank you so much, sir, for this interview. And we'll have an unofficial chat as well. I'll try to record that as well so that we can learn something new, other things.
Pleasure.
So, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
An official meet as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.